The late 60s were a kind of confluence of several rivulets. There was the anti-war movement itself. The whole movement towards racial equality, the environment, the role of women. And the anthems for that counterculture were provided by the most brilliant rock and roll music that you can imagine. I don't know how we could exist today as a country without that experience. With all of its warts and ups and downs, that produced the America we have today, and we are better for it. And I felt that way in Vietnam. I turned the volume up on all that stuff. That represented what I was trying to defend.
In the documentary, there is an American soldier, former soldier, who later became a senior general in the United States Army. Quite a clever sleight of hand. He says, well, we were fighting in the war to preserve American values, and we knew there was the black people were rioting in the cities of the states, that there was a big anti-war movement, and it was these values we were fighting for, which did make me chuckle a bit, because the racism inside the United States Army came to the fore during the Vietnam War. Lots and lots of reported instances, not just of African American, but African American and dissident white soldiers often shooting their officers in the back. These are not a few episodes. And the Vietnamese propaganda often targeted black Americans in the war. If you listen to it, they talked about lynchings, they talked about equal rights, and that did have an impact. But the thing I think that was the most decisive was that the soldiers and many officers, junior officers, began to realize that this war was unwinnable. And so this business of we were fighting for American values like the anti-war movement, in retrospect, is just a justification.
But it's based on an absolute myopia, a short-sightedness, because all the Americans could see was the red flag of communism. In fact, and we may not all agree on this, but it seems to me it was the high-octane fuel of nationalism that powered the Vietnamese struggle through 40 years of wars. There are other things to be said about the politics of that, but the Americans didn't see that subtlety. They didn't see rural peasantry in revolt against a landlord class. All they could see was an imposition of the Cold War on this conflict. And it was a savagely dangerous mistake to make.
Going back to the nationalism and communism thing, I think it closely relates to your earlier question, the French and American transitions. You know, when Ho Chi Minh stood in Hanoi Square, and you know, this incredible crowd, and
proclaiming independence.
Proclaiming independence. He brought in quote from the American Declaration of Independence, and he made it very clear that, well, despite some confusions, you know, to show that we are all into self-determination. That's all we want. And it goes back to Wilsonian doctrine. It's something that Americans are very proud of and very familiar with in their modern history. There was several scholars, a few friends of mine are also involved, how that merging of Vietnamese and American political imaginaries, or the potentials for mutual understanding, fell apart in the following years. And I think in some ways, from the Vietnamese perspective, just as Americans considered Ho Chi Minh and his cohort as allies during the Second World War, and the Vietnamese saw United States unlike any previous European powers. This is different Western power. But as they witnessed the way the French effort to recolonize Vietnam as it progressed in incredible violence in the beginning of 1950s, in the villages I worked, is what happened in 1967 and 68. In the My Lai is a singular, is a tip of iceberg. It's a great swath of central Vietnam. It's just human tragedy. And there is considerable similarity between what happened in 1967 and 68 and earlier years, say like 1952, 1953 under French.
Heonik, it was interesting that the documentary didn't cover My Lai until the American public found out about it in 1969, and not when it happened in 1967. This again reinforces that this is really an American history of the war. I don't think the documentary did enough to show the extent of these atrocities from the point of view of the Vietnamese themselves.
Charges have been made that troops of the Americal Division killed as many as 567 South Vietnamese civilians during a sweep in March 1968.
20 months earlier, on the morning of March 16, 1968, 105 men from a rifle company belonging to the Americal Division and led by Captain Ernest Medina and Lieutenant William Calley had been ordered to helicopter into the village of My Lai 4. Since arriving in Vietnam, they had lost 28 men to mines and booby traps and unseen snipers. 2 days earlier, a popular squad leader had been killed. They had been told a unit of Main Force Viet Cong was waiting for them, and they were eager for revenge. But they received no hostile fire, encountered no enemy soldiers. Instead, over the next 4 hours, Medina, Calley, and their men murdered 407 defenseless old men, women, children, and infants.
You know, how can we blame Vietnamese, the people there? We are different. We Americans are different. Look at us. We just see us differently from the earlier colonial masters. But on the ground, it's impossible for the ordinary Vietnamese not to see Americans rather than other than French, but an extension of French occupation on the ground. So in many ways, I think the seeds of many tragedies during the what we call Vietnam War was sown in the American support for the French war, which is real tragic. And I think it's still, me included, and all of us are searching for an answer. Why? Why did you support the French to recolonize Vietnam after 1945? I mean, there are many, many answers, but in the end, the question still remains, why did you do that?
Heonik, I think one reason for that was that American foreign policy, which had largely been isolationist, except in relation to South America, where they were always interventionist, and which they referred to as our backyard, and the Monroe Doctrine, which said to the European powers, you can do what you want elsewhere in the world, but don't come near South America. And this started in 1917, the first secret committee in American history of the intelligence services was set up after the Russian Revolution, where they decided that they were going to carry out secret interventions because this was the country challenging capitalism. It's nothing to do with democracy, because most of the capitalist world, only half the population voted. You know, women weren't allowed the right to vote till well after the war. So they decided this was the enemy because it challenges our system of economic values, capitalism, and says they're going to take the world and transform it into a socialist world, and are trying to do so. So that is the target. They rebuilt their future allies. I mean, why would a power which strongly believed in economic competition, rebuild Germany, rebuild Britain, rebuild France, rebuild Japan, divide Korea and make South Korea a showcase for them in Asia, which didn't quite work. It was precisely in order to make it impossible for any further triumph. So if you see it from that point of view, what they did was not 100% irrational. It was twisted, it was distorted, but it was very much part of their overall aim of global hegemony, which they then got in '91, where the whole world more or less went capitalist, and still they were not satisfied.
As Gore Vidal, I remember hearing him talk in Los Angeles, and he said the transition from republic to empire was where it all happened. And in the documentaries we were talking about, but also I would want to say also in fiction films like Platoon, you know, like Apocalypse Now, you know, these films as well, Deer Hunter, I mean 600 films made about Vietnam, nearly all after the war was over. There is this sense of the self-preoccupation of the empire. Psychologically, as it were. I mean, there's a little British variant going on with Brexit at the moment. But in America, all these films, fiction as well as documentary, are about our concerns in working ourselves out. There's never any understanding of a point of view or a perspective from what you refer to as the other. How does it look from elsewhere? How does it look from, in fact, the majority of the world that is outside the hegemon? I'm afraid that, though there are many good aspects to it, these documentaries, like brilliant fiction films that have been made, actually perpetuate that introversion, that insularity of the American project, which is not finished yet.
Which is certainly not.
Indeed, no.
On the morning of June 8th, 1972, Nick Ut, a 21-year-old South Vietnamese photographer working for the Associated Press, was accompanying Arvin troops on Highway 1, moving toward a village called Trang Bang to dislodge North Vietnamese forces that had occupied it during the Easter Offensive. Ut was beginning to put his cameras away, ready to return to Saigon, when he saw a South Vietnamese fighter suddenly dip down toward the fleeing refugees, whom the pilot mistook for the enemy.
To the end of the episodes, the napalm attack involving this, what some people call the napalm girl, Kim Phuc, it's a very familiar story to American public. So I was glad to, and the footage was longer than what you normally see in other documentaries. It had a view. It offered a view to the victim, as well as those who film the victim, the girls and other children running away from the village.
That's very interesting in this context, because the depiction of the napalm bombing was very interesting to see, because the movie camera showed the way that the famous photograph was cropped. And that photograph is iconic, by the way. I saw it a couple of weeks ago in West Belfast, where it's on the wall, but transposed to Gaza. So in referring to Vietnam, that transposes it to the Israeli attack on Gaza. But actually, the media had a really crucial role, because it was the last war that was not controlled in terms of media access. I mean, in the wars that have been fought since, there are embedded reporters, there are clear rules whereby you do not see a number of coffins going into a plane. And I think that the Vietnam War, although sometimes it's overstated, that, you know, there were pinko reporters, which when people look carefully and count the articles, that isn't so true. But it is true that the imagery from Vietnam was part of leading to a mobilization against it, I think.
The documentary, of course, and this we must acknowledge, shows the anti-war movement rising. Rod, in that country. And I have always felt that this anti-war movement that developed in the United States of America during the Vietnam War has no precedent in the history of any imperial country. So this development of the anti-war movement, I think, had, again, two causes. One was that people could see that General Westmoreland was lying. We're going to come, the boys are going to come home next year, the boys are coming, etc., which the documentary shows some of.
Backed at home by resolve, confidence, patience, determination, and continued support, we will prevail in Vietnam over the communist aggressor.
And I find an attitude of confidence and growing optimism. It prevails all over the country. And to me, this is the most significant evidence I can give you that constant, real progress is being made.
And so the anti-war fervor began to grow when people in the United States, partially as a result of decent television and newspaper reporting, relatively, began to see that this war was unwinnable. And the big event, I mean, of course, there were mobilizations all over the United States, but the big event, I think, which must have shaken the Pentagon more than almost anything else, was the huge march of well over 100,000 GIs, ex-GIs, GIs with their Purple Hearts, their medals, GIs without a leg, GIs without an arm, marching in front of the Pentagon and chanting, "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win." This, the documentary didn't show, though they did have some very good footage of when the veterans threw their medals at the White House.
Cross of gallantry, distinguished flying cross, and everything else. I don't want these fucking medals, man. The Silver Star, the third highest medal in the country. It doesn't mean anything. Bob Neal died for these medals. Lieutenant Pomeroy died, so I got a medal. Sergeant Johns died, so I got a medal. I got a Silver Star, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal, 8 Air Medals, National Defense, and the rest of this garbage. It doesn't mean a thing.
They were all retired, it should be said, by that time. They were veterans against the war. But when you have your own army and your own soldiers chanting outside your command headquarters that they want the so-called enemy to win, I think that had a big impact on the war. And you were mentioning earlier, Rod, when the cameras were off, that the Vietnamese gave a great deal of importance to international solidarity, especially from the United States, but from all over the world.
It was extraordinary, the scale of it, because I was 15 in 1968, and I went to see The Green Berets, a unique film because it's the only feature film that actually supported the American war effort. John Wayne effectively directed it and starred in it. And seeing it in a rather, how do I say, conservative, provincial place like Torquay and Devon, there were the Torbay young socialists handing out leaflets denouncing the film outside a local cinema. I was 15 at the time, but that's the scale of the anti-war movement right across the Western world. Extraordinary.
The first, I would argue, really strong anti-war movement erupted in Japan in the 50s. The Japanese students were demanding a neutral Japan. They didn't want to be part of one power bloc or the other. It was not that they were demanding an alliance with China or the Soviet Union. They didn't want to be subordinate to the United States. And they invented, I mean, some of the most inventive student movements in the world was the Japanese one, with their snake dances and, you know, defeating people, and they were not that violent against the police, so they tried to avoid all that. And that triggered off slowly back into the United States as well, because you saw it on your television screens in those days.
I thought the film could have done more justice to the significance of the antiwar movement in Japan and elsewhere outside the United States, which is very contemporary history in Japan, is the peace movement, and this anti-constitutional change movement has a roots, as you say, 1950s, but more prominently, more demonstratively in the anti-Vietnam War or global anti-Vietnam War movement. And one singular country in Asia, one Asian country that erupted in 1967 and 68 in protest of Vietnam War was Japan. And so in some ways we can say there are two pictures, there are two sides to this. Japan was not really Asian country, whereas all over Asia was burning, and Japan had joined Europe and United States through this global civil movement. But on the other hand, it was a singular Asian country that joined this global movement, and it's that the relevance of which still continues today. And so I thought if the make of the scenario for this film had a more global view on, because in current times, in today, the United States is pushing Japan a lot to take on more obligation in East Asia and the broader region for security reasons and such. And then in that grand scheme, the history of Japan's peace movement or anti-war movement is bubbling up. And then how we, in how we choose to highlight certain aspects of the 1968, 67, 68 in the world has a lot of relevance for how we envision our future. So I thought, that was one disappointment. Huge, to me, it's a huge disappointment that, again, it's very focused introvertively on the United States.
Yes, I was a Marine, but I was first and foremost a citizen of the United States of America. And being a citizen, I had certain responsibilities. And the largest of those responsibilities was standing up to your government and saying no when it's doing something that you think is not in this nation's best interest. That is the most important job that every citizen has. I served my country as honorably when I was in Vietnam Veterans Against the War as I did as a United States Marine. And in fact, I conducted myself as a Marine the whole time I was in VVAW. My whole life I conduct myself as a Marine.
It's what Rod calls U.S. parochialism.
U.S. parochialism,
which infects the culture on every level, including the left. Actually.
So I thought about Tony Judd, what he said. It's kind of so parochial, it's still going on. And so that was great disappointment to the end.
And so Mario Savio and his friends in Berkeley admitted that they had learned a lot from the Japanese when it became time to start a movement against the Vietnam War. But I don't think any of us who were in that movement recognized or realized the effect it was going to have. And it's, of course, the United States movement which was decisive. But not just that. I mean, we had in this country where troops were not sent by the Harold Wilson Labour government. They supported the war. Wilson refused to send troops. We were demonstrating that Labour should withdraw its support from the United States and support the side that was fighting for its rights, the right to self-determination. And so the movement in Britain became quite huge. The movement in France became huge. The movement in Germany, which now was incredibly large. A whole generation of young Germans said no war. You've told us how evil war is, how bad war is, and what do we do when the Americans behave just like the Third Reich used to do in disregarding civilian deaths and civilian casualties.
But one factor in this is about image control. We live within an image system, and as we touched on earlier, the Vietnam War did not have the sophisticated image control that subsequent wars have. From the critical reporting, the Zippo lighter, the shooting of the Viet Cong commander in the Tet Offensive, all of those were a factor in building an opposition. Once the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq started, we do not see that. I mean, the British coffins are sort of brought on a back route through a RAF Oxfordshire or something. We do not see the effect of the war. And I remember a photographer, a British photographer, who was embedded in a British Army medical unit in Camp Bastian, showing the way that contemporary advanced medical techniques basically piece people together to bring them back alive. God knows what life they can have, but they're brought back alive. So the casualty figures are controlled. The dead in contemporary wars are small. The wounded, which no one notices, are bigger. But you know, contemporary advanced medicine can mean that less people die. And so the spin and control of the image of the wars that have taken place subsequently to Vietnam is one factor in not allowing, I suppose also not shooting students like at Kent State is also something that they have understood and would not be so crazy as to repeat. Let's hope.
We've almost come to the end of this discussion on this 18-hour documentary. And I hope we've done some justice to it. But all in all, both of you, are we pleased that this documentary was made? However faulty and defective it is it better that it was made, or would it have been better that it had not been made?
Definitely, yes. It's, I think, because I don't know whether we can call it revisionist movement in the United States. It's a history of the Vietnam War, but there has been quite considerable push to either forget the war or redefine the war in recent years. Despite all weaknesses, I think the presence of this new mega production on the Vietnam War, with its length and the money put into it, it has a very authoritative take on the historical narrative. And I think, I'm glad it is there, and I think it will contribute to blocking certain dangerous trends, at least, or prolonging the real, serious reflection on the soul of the United States for another time. But meanwhile, it is still there. It refuses to be forgotten. In that sense, I think it has made huge contribution.
I'd agree. I think a substantial enterprise which takes 10 years, which takes 18 hours of television, which costs $30 million, sets an agenda which leads to arguments taking place. We may not agree with some of the terms of the agenda, but as we watch the programs, online as well as around a television set, we begin to take elements and re-articulate them. And as someone who's worked in television, you have to believe that you are not controlling all the meanings, that things will be taken up and enter into argument by individuals who counter the claustrophobic, dampening control of many mainstream messages. This series got some things wrong, but actually at least sets out an agenda for debate, and that's to be welcome.
And I think an important thing to remember is that people aren't stupid. They know how to read, maybe less so than they used to, but they will take from these documentaries what they wish to take and kick the other bits away. Thank you very much.
Thank you.